I stopped by my daughter's house in Houston like I always do. Sunday porch light, mail on the mat, a pie on the seat beside me. The front door was unlocked, toys abandoned, and my son-in-law swore she was fine. But he wouldn't let me call her. A man my age knows when a home has gone cold, and that silence cut deeper than words. He didn't know I'd already saved everything. Texts, forged bank slips, and a voice memo ready if anyone cried for help. Then I heard it from upstairs, a fragile whisper. "Grandpa, don't leave." That one sentence changed everything. Follow this story to the end. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And drop your city in the comments so I know you're here with me. 2 weeks had passed without a word from Marla. The silence stretched longer each day, filling the house like a draft that wouldn't leave. Each morning began the same way, a call that rang into emptiness, the same hollow ring echoing in my ear until it cut off. Every night ended with me staring at my phone, hoping for her voice. Instead, I got curt, clipped texts from Daryl, always excuses. "She's resting. She's busy." Nothing more. The tone sat wrong, the way words can when they're meant to push you back instead of draw you close. The quiet gnawed at me. A father knows the rhythms of his daughter's life, the little ways she says she's okay without saying it, and I hadn't heard a single one of those in 14 days. The unease wasn't a sudden strike. It was slow, steady, seeping into my bones like damp air. By the second week, that quiet felt less like absence and more like a warning. I told myself she was grown. She had her own family, her own house. But even as I tried to reason with the voice inside, the weight of unanswered calls pressed harder on my chest. A man can only wait so long before waiting feels like giving up. That Saturday, the morning light didn't bring comfort. It just highlighted the stillness in my kitchen, the way the clock ticked too loudly. I put on my jacket and grabbed my keys. If she wouldn't answer, then I'd find out for myself. The drive across town felt longer than usual, though the roads were clear. Houston's suburban stretch rolled past, neatly trimmed lawns, quiet cul-de-sacs, families watering plants or washing cars. Normal life played out in every direction, sharp against the churn in my chest. Her street looked the same as always, the rows of houses standing tidy and calm, but her porch told another story. The mail had piled up, envelopes stacked unevenly, some slipping onto the welcome mat. No one had picked them up in days. That small sight tugged at the knot already in my stomach, pulling it tighter. I parked at the curb, sitting for a moment with my hand resting on the steering wheel. The neighborhood's calm only deepened the unease. It shouldn't have been possible for something to feel so wrong in a place that looked so right. The front door wasn't shut all the way. It hung just slightly open, the edge catching the frame but not closing. My hand hesitated on the knob, listening. The house was still, too still. Though it was late afternoon, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air felt different, stale, unmoved, like no one had bothered to open a window in weeks. Shadows filled the living room despite the daylight outside. Photo frames along the wall tilted as though someone had brushed past too roughly. Bills sat scattered across the coffee table, a corner of a torn calendar page peeking out. My birthday had been circled on it. The circle was gone now, ripped away with the paper. The room didn't scream disaster. It whispered something worse. I moved further in. The kitchen sink was full of dishes. Watermarks streaked across the plates as if they'd sat there untouched for days. The stale air carried a faint odor of food left too long. Clara's toys, her little dolls and blocks, lay abandoned in the corner, not tucked away like Marla always did after bedtime. On the counter sat a grocery list, half written in Marla's handwriting. Eggs, milk, bread. At the bottom, scrawled more hurriedly, pain meds. The words sent a chill through me. She wasn't one to write that unless something was wrong. I stood in the silence, every detail a piece of a picture I didn't want to finish. Something had erased her presence here. Something had stripped the home of her warmth. And then came the sound, a faint shift upstairs, just enough to freeze me mid-breath. Not the creak of a house settling, not the wind, Something, or someone, was moving above me. My hand closed around the banister. The wood was cool, grounding, but my chest pounded hard enough to drown out thought. As I placed my hand on the banister, the sound of something shifting upstairs froze me in place. The creak above me was more than just a sound. It was the weight of a secret pressing down. My hand tightened on the banister as I called Marla's name. Though the word broke in my throat, silence swallowed it whole. Each step up the stairs felt heavier than the last, as if the house itself resisted me. The carpet smelled faintly of dust, untouched for days, and the air grew colder with every foot I climbed. Clara's door stood slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I was met by stillness. Toys scattered across the rug, a stuffed bear on its side, a tiny tea set arranged as if waiting for a guest who never came. Everything frozen in time. A hollow pang sank deeper into my chest. That room should have been full of giggles and light, but instead it was suffocating in its absence. Marla's voice didn't answer when I whispered her name again. The silence mocked me, telling me I was too late, that something had been stolen from under my nose while I stood helpless. I closed Clara's door softly, afraid even the sound of wood clicking into place might break what little thread of calm I still held. The creak I had heard earlier could have been anything, a draft, the house settling, but it didn't feel like that. It felt intentional, like someone testing me. My legs moved on their own, carrying me toward Marla's room. The door was shut tight. I reached for the handle but stopped, pressing my forehead against the cool wood, whispering her name once more. No answer. My hand trembled, but I forced it still. I wasn't leaving without answers. The memory of a text message flashed across my mind, as if summoned by the silence. A week ago, my birthday dinner had been canceled. The message said Marla wasn't feeling well, that we should reschedule, but the words hadn't sounded like her. Short, clipped sentences. No warmth. No love you, Dad. At the time, I tried to convince myself she was tired, distracted. Now the pieces slid into place with a cruel edge. It hadn't been her at all. A rush of heat rose through me, anger cutting through the fog of fear. Daryl had sent that message. He'd spoken in her place, stolen her voice, my daughter's affection, my role as her father, erased with a few keystrokes. My birthday, once circled on her calendar, was torn away. The cruelty wasn't only in what he did, but in the way he made me feel invisible, as if my bond with Marla could be replaced by his control. The anger didn't stay steady, it cracked, spilling into dread. If he could cancel my birthday on her behalf, what else had he stolen from her? I stepped back from Marla's door, my pulse hammering. The air in the hallway grew too heavy. I needed light. Air. Something real to anchor me. My feet carried me back down the stairs and out the front door, the evening breeze brushing my face. Across the street, Lydia Brackett knelt in her garden, clipping the last of her summer roses. She looked up with a smile, one of those neighborly ones people wear when they've seen you 100 times but never really known you. "Evening. Mr. Rayner?" she called. "Haven't seen Marla around much lately. Just Daryl. In and out. Busy man. That one." Her voice was casual, friendly, but each word cut deep. To her, it was an observation, a simple truth. To me, it was confirmation of every fear I'd been swallowing. She hadn't seen Marla, only Daryl. My daughter's life had shrunk down to silence, hidden behind walls I couldn't yet breach. "She must be so happy, married to a man that busy," Lydia added with a chuckle, returning to her roses. The irony stung worse than a thorn. Happy. My daughter, locked in quiet absence, erased from her own world. I swallowed hard, forcing a polite nod, unable to answer. Lydia meant no harm, but her words underlined the truth. From the outside, everything looked perfect, and that was the most dangerous lie of all. I stepped back inside, shutting the door with a weight that shook the frame. The house greeted me with its stale air again. My eyes fell on the kitchen table. It was set neatly for 2, maybe 3, plates aligned, silverware polished. A birthday card rested unopened near the salt shaker, its envelope still blank. The wine glasses were tucked neatly in the cabinet, untouched. The dinner that never was. Daryl hadn't just canceled the dinner. He had staged this. leaving me out of the picture as if I never mattered. As if the role of father had no place in Marla's life anymore. It wasn't absence. It was deliberate erasure. The roar of an engine cut through the silence. Through the blinds, headlights washed across the driveway. The shape of Daryl's car slid into place, settling in like a predator returning to its den. My heart slammed against my ribs. The quiet house no longer felt empty. It felt like a trap about to spring. Through the blinds, I saw Daryl's headlights cut across the driveway, and I knew my questions would no longer wait. The front door clicked shut behind Daryl, his footsteps slow and deliberate as he entered the house. He set his keys down with a practiced clink, his face composed into something almost too calm. "She's upstairs resting," he said lightly, as if the tension humming between us could be brushed away with those words. I stayed rooted by the kitchen counter, my eyes locked on his. "Resting?" The words stuck in my throat. "She hasn't returned my calls for 2 weeks." "You expect me to believe she's just lying in bed?" He offered a small, measured shrug, his lips curving into a polite but hollow smile. "Marla's been tired, that's all. You know how busy she gets with Clara and the house. She didn't want to worry you." The air thickened. There was no warmth in his tone, only a sharp edge of dismissal. My questions clung to the silence like smoke refusing to clear. I wanted to shout, to grab him by the collar and demand answers. But something in his gaze warned me. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. The kind of watchful coldness that made my skin crawl. I pulled back, pretending to accept his words. But inside, the unease twisted deeper. Something in his manner told me more than his words ever could. He was hiding something. On my way here, before all of this, a memory had tugged at me. Now it surged back with cruel clarity. It was earlier that week, in a small grocery store a few miles from my home. I had been standing near the dairy section when I caught sight of Marla. My heart leapt, ready to call out to her, but she turned her head away as if she hadn't seen me. I almost convinced myself it was an accident, that maybe she was distracted, but then I noticed the scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, and the way it slipped for a moment when she bent to pick up a carton. Beneath the fabric, faint and ugly, was a bruise darkening her skin. She had pulled the scarf back up quickly, adjusted her hair, and slipped past me before I could say a word. The look in her eyes, just for a fraction of a second, wasn't avoidance. It was desperation. Standing here now, with Daryl feeding me half-truths, that memory felt like a blade twisting in my chest. My eyes drifted to the trash bin near the counter. Something caught my attention, a crumpled white pharmacy bag peeking out from beneath yesterday's paper. I pulled it free, smoothing the wrinkles with trembling fingers. Inside was a receipt. The date was just a few days ago. The prescription bore Marla's name. But what unsettled me wasn't the name. It was the medication. Heavy sedatives, enough to dull a person's will, enough to blur days into shadows. I stared at the printed words, my pulse hammering. Was he drugging her, keeping her locked in some fog where she couldn't reach out for help? The receipt burned in my hand, proof that my instincts weren't born from paranoia. Something cruel was happening here, and Daryl was at the center of it. I stuffed the paper back into the bag and lowered it quietly into the bin, my mind racing. He was still only a few feet away, pretending to tidy the counter, but I could feel his eyes tracking me. I sat at the kitchen table, folding my hands as if in patience. The chair creaked beneath me, the only sound breaking the silence. Daryl muttered something about reheating leftovers, but his movements were clumsy, a mask cracking at the edges. The truth was right there, bleeding through every gesture. He was hiding her, lying to me, erasing me from her life piece by piece. I clenched my jaw, fighting the urge to confront him head on. Not yet. The moment wasn't ripe, and I needed more than anger to face him. Then it came, the faintest sound, so fragile it might have been my imagination. From upstairs, through the plaster and walls, came a muffled cry. It was raw, choked, unmistakably human. My chest tightened, every nerve alive. That wasn't the sound of someone resting. It was the sound of someone broken, calling from behind the veil of silence Daryl had drawn around this house. Somewhere above, muffled and raw, I heard a cry that no wall could hide. The silence in the house pressed harder than the night itself. Standing in the living room, something felt wrong, like a familiar melody missing its final note. My eyes traveled along the wall where, for years, the portrait of my late wife and me had hung, a reminder of the life Marla was born into. The spot was bare. In its place now stood a glossy enlargement of Marla and Daryl on their wedding day. Their smiles felt staged, frozen in a moment meant to erase everything that came before. The absence of that portrait hit deeper than words could carry. It wasn't just a picture taken down, it was a piece of history scrubbed away, an attempt to rewrite the story of this family without me, without her mother. My chest tightened. To see my face, my wife's face, erased so casually, it was as if someone had tried to strike us out of memory itself. Daryl walked in behind me, carrying himself with the calm swagger of a man who thought he owned every corner of this house. "Redecorating," he said, his tone deliberately casual, as though my pain were nothing more than old wallpaper being stripped. I steadied my voice, though it shook with heat underneath. That wasn't Marla's choice. She would never remove her mother's picture. Never. He shrugged, looking almost bored. "Things change, Elmer. Maybe it's time you accepted that." The air thickened between us. His eyes narrowed just slightly, daring me to push harder. My voice dropped lower, but every word carried weight. "If you think you can erase me from her life, you don't know the first thing about family." For a second, the mask cracked, his jaw tightened, his smirk faltered, but he recovered, stepping closer as though proximity gave him power. "Don't test me. She's happy. Let her live her life." Before I could reply, the doorbell rang. The sudden sound broke the tension like a snapped string. When I opened the door, Lydia Brackett stood outside, holding a casserole dish wrapped in foil. She offered a bright smile, her voice cheery as she explained it was just something extra from her kitchen. Behind me, Daryl's entire demeanor transformed. He draped an arm around Marla, who had come halfway down the stairs. His hand settled on her shoulder like a stage prop, his grin wide, rehearsed, almost saccharine. To Lydia, it must have looked like a picture of happiness, a doting husband, a family man. But I saw Marla's hand tremble where it rested against the banister. The shake was faint, but unmistakable. My gut clenched. She didn't meet my eyes, didn't look at anyone for more than a second. Lydia, oblivious, chattered on about how lovely it was to see young love so strong. She handed the dish over, wished us a pleasant evening, and walked back into the glow of her yard lights. As the door closed, Marla retreated almost instantly, disappearing up the stairs without a word. Daryl lingered, his smirk returning, sharper now, cutting deeper. He looked at me, not with warmth or family recognition, but with a predator's amusement. That was when I heard it, soft, almost hidden beneath the creaks of the old house. Clara's voice, no louder than a breath, carried down from the shadows above. "Grandpa, please don't leave." The plea cut deeper than any insult, sharper than Daryl's smirk. My fists clenched at my sides. In that fragile whisper, all the strength of my purpose returned. This wasn't just about me anymore, it never had been. Clara's whisper clung to me like a lifeline. Her little voice had been barely audible, but the weight of it settled heavy on my chest. Kneeling, I placed a hand gently on her shoulder, feeling the tremble that ran through her small frame. "You're safe," I murmured, though the words felt fragile, almost like lies. Behind us, the house seemed to breathe with unease, the silence sharp, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and Clara's shallow breaths. The thought hit hard. Every time I'd stayed quiet, every time I told myself it wasn't my place, I had allowed this sickness to grow. My daughter had disappeared, my granddaughter whispered for help, and the man standing between them and peace thrived on my restraint. That could no longer continue. Silence, once my shield, had now become their cage. Rising, I met Clara's eyes one last time. "I hear you," I said, though softly enough to avoid drawing Daryl's attention. Her gaze pleaded for something more, but what I could offer now was resolve, the promise that I would no longer walk away. The living room greeted me like a battlefield, waiting for its first shot to be fired. Daryl sat lounging on the arm of the sofa, a crooked smile plastered on his face as if he had been waiting for me to step back in. "Finished with story time?" he asked, his tone laced with mockery. I didn't hesitate. "Where's Marla?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended, slicing through the stale air. Daryl chuckled, leaning back as if amused. "Resting. You know, some people work for a living. She's tired." "That bruise I saw at the store last week?" I pressed, voice tightening. "The canceled dinner, the torn calendar. You think I don't notice? You've been isolating her." "Daryl? You've been hurting her." The grin faded, his jaw tightening as he leaned forward, voice dropping. "You're senile, old man. You see shadows where there are none. You're meddling in things that don't concern you." "They concern me," I shot back. "She's my daughter. Clara is my granddaughter." "And I won't stand here while I what?" he barked, rising now, the room shrinking as he stepped closer. "You think you're some hero? You're a relic, Elmer, always clinging to the past. You should have stayed out of this house." His words stung, but they only fanned the fire that Clara's whisper had lit. There would be no retreat. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the charged silence. Marla appeared, her face pale, her eyes wide with dread. She clutched the railing as though it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Dad, please." Her voice wavered, each syllable heavy with strain. "Go home. Don't make this worse." Her hand trembled as she adjusted the sleeve of her blouse, and for the first time, I caught sight of the swelling around her wrist. My breath caught. Proof. Undeniable and cruel. I took a step toward her, but she recoiled slightly, shaking her head. "Please, just leave." Her voice cracked, but beneath the fear, there was something else. A plea not to abandon her completely. Though her lips couldn't form the words, Daryl crossed his arms, smirking at me like a victor enjoying the collapse of his opponent. But my daughter's swollen wrist, her trembling voice, told me everything I needed. She was trapped, and my leaving would only sink her deeper into this prison he'd built. "I will not abandon you," I said firmly, planting myself between Marla and Daryl. Daryl's eyes darkened, the smirk dissolving into a sneer. "Then you'd better be ready for what comes next." His voice was venomous, low enough that Clara upstairs might not hear, but sharp enough to draw blood all the same. My heart pounded, not with fear, but with the clarity of purpose. I straightened, every fiber of my being alive with determination. "You've had your say," I told him. "But this ends here." He took a threatening step forward, his chest brushing against mine, his shadow swallowing me whole. The tension was seconds from snapping when Clara's sobs pierced the house, high and panicked, cutting through everything. The sound stopped both of us in our tracks. Her cries filled the silence like a warning bell, a reminder of who was watching, who would suffer if this spiraled further. I held my ground, eyes locked with Daryl's, the standoff unbroken. This wasn't just a clash of wills anymore. It was the opening volley in a war neither of us could avoid. The air in the house grew heavier after Clara's sobs cut through the tense silence. Daryl had lunged toward me, his hand outstretched as if to shove me out the door. But her crying pierced the moment like a siren. His steps faltered, shoulders tightening as he glanced toward the stairs where her small voice echoed. That pause gave me all I needed. Feet planted firmly on the worn rug, I met his glare with steady eyes. Retreat had never been an option. Every muscle in my body screamed with age, yet some stubborn force rooted me there. His hand hovered, then dropped, though the malice in his face didn't soften. The battle line between us was drawn, invisible yet undeniable. The sobs upstairs carried down like a plea for me not to falter. Rage simmered under my ribs, but resolve sharpened it into something steadier. This wasn't just about me. It was about a daughter too afraid to speak, and a granddaughter whose whispers carried the truth no one else would. Daryl muttered something under his breath about old men overstaying their welcome, but my ears caught every syllable. His words rolled off me, empty noise against a conviction that had finally solidified. Silence had ended. War had begun. The kitchen light flickered faintly, casting shadows that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my heart. While Daryl busied himself with clearing the table in an exaggerated display of control, my eyes wandered. There, half buried beneath a pile of bills and circulars on the counter, lay a manila folder. Something about the placement, just a little too hidden, just a little too deliberate, drew me in. My hand brushed across the edge of the folder, tugging it free with careful fingers. Inside, a chill tightened my chest. Authorization forms, checks, documents, all signed in my name, only they weren't my signature. The strokes were clumsy imitations of my hand, close enough for a bank teller, maybe even a lawyer, but not close enough for me. Shock burned into betrayal as I thumbed through page after page, transfers tied to Marla's accounts, papers that reeked of manipulation and theft. My blood surged hot, righteous fury rushing through veins that had carried 70 years of quiet sacrifice. This was more than cruelty, it was calculated erasure. Behind me, a chair scraped the floor. Daryl's eyes darted toward the folder, his smirk twitching into something darker. I slid the papers back with deliberate calm, though my pulse hammered in my throat. Betrayal had a weight to it, and it pressed down heavier than age ever could. My hand went instinctively to my pocket, fumbling for the old phone I carried more out of habit than use. Its screen was cracked, its battery weak, but it still held a camera. The advice of an old friend, a lawyer long since retired, whispered in memory, "Truth needs a witness. Elmer, paper can vanish. Memory can be twisted, but a witness, that lasts." I angled the folder just so, snapping quick photos of the forged signatures, the letterhead, the dates. The faint click of the shutter sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I slipped the phone back with a quiet motion, heart pounding but steady. This was the first stone laid on a road I hadn't wanted to walk, but now had no choice but to follow. The weight of the evidence sat heavy in my pocket, heavier still in my conscience. If I turned away now, I would be complicit in the very erasure he intended. The man across the room thought age meant weakness, but he had never seen what endurance looked like. My life had been built on it. Tonight would be no different. The scrape of his boots against the tile echoed closer. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, face a mask of casual contempt. "Looking for something, old man?" His tone dripped with false amusement, each word sharpened with threat. I straightened slowly, turning to face him. "If you think I'm blind, you're mistaken." The words came calm, measured, stripped of heat, but edged with steel. For the first time that night, his smirk faltered, not gone, but cracked. Marla lingered at the doorway, her eyes wide, her hands twisted together as though she wanted to reach for me but couldn't. Her silence was its own language, fear etched into every line of her face, yet something else too, something closer to hope. Daryl's eyes narrowed, his gaze dropping briefly to my pocket. He had noticed the way I lingered near the folder. He had seen the phone. The room held its breath, waiting for which of us would break it. I slipped my hands into my pockets, steady as stone. Even as his glare tracked the outline of the phone, the weight of his suspicion pressed down, thick as the humid Texas night. He knew I had taken something from him, and I knew he would never let that go unanswered. Daryl's shadow stretched across the hallway as his voice cut through the fragile quiet of the house. He accused me of meddling, his words sharpened to sound like concern for Clara. "You're confusing her," he hissed, his tone dripping with false righteousness. He twisted the picture, making it seem as though I was the one planting doubt in the child's mind. Clara's name became a weapon in his hands. Marla stood at the edge of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trembling against the fabric of her dress. She said nothing, but her eyes pleaded in a way her lips refused to. That silence told me everything. Daryl had made her fear even her own voice. The accusations weighed on me, not because they were true, but because of how skillfully they could be made to sound true to someone who didn't know better. In that moment, I realized I wasn't just fighting for my daughter's safety. I was fighting for my name, my sanity, and the memory of every sacrifice I had made for this family. Daryl wasn't finished. He strode to a drawer, pulling out a manila folder and tossing it onto the table. Papers spilled across the wood like cards in a gambler's hand. "Look at this," he said, almost smug. You're broke. Elmer, you've been unstable for years. If this gets out, nobody will believe a word you say. The documents were neat, official-looking, bank statements, letters, even a doctor's note with a signature that mimicked my physician's scrawl. Every sheet was a lie, crafted with the kind of precision that only someone determined to destroy another man's standing could create. Twist knotted my stomach. This wasn't just cruelty behind closed doors. Darryl had thought ahead, building walls of falsehood so that when I pushed back, the world would see only an old man losing his grip on reality. Anger burned hot in my chest, but beneath it was something heavier, fear, not for myself, but for Marla and Clara. If Darryl was willing to fabricate this, what else had he planned? How far would he go to keep control? Later, when I stepped into the yard under the dim glow of the porch light, the quiet felt suffocating. Lydia Brackett's wave from across the street earlier replayed in my mind. It had seemed kind then, but now I questioned it. Darryl had been spinning stories, and I wondered how many neighbors, cousins, and friends had already heard his version of me. The word senile lingered in my thoughts like poison. It was the oldest trick: strip an elder of credibility, and their truth dissolves before it can be spoken. Every memory of family gatherings where my voice once mattered felt like it had been stolen in advance by Darryl's lies. I could almost hear the whispers he had planted. Poor Elmer. He's not what he used to be. That isolation was his weapon now, just as sharp as his fists had ever been against Marla's spirit. Back inside, I found myself alone in the hallway, the weight of the house pressing in. My phone felt heavy in my palm. It wasn't much, a battered old thing with a cracked screen, but it could still carry truth. I opened the recorder and, with a voice rough but steady, began to speak. "My name is Elmer Rayner," I said into the silence. "If these words are ever heard, know this: the lies in this house do not belong to me. I have lived long enough to see my family twisted by deceit, but I will not let the truth die with me." I spoke of the forged documents, of the bruises I had glimpsed, of Clara's whisper in the dark. Each word was a thread, weaving a net that might one day catch Darryl's cruelty. Closing my eyes, I whispered the promise I had made silently in my heart. If I fall, the truth won't fall with me. Just then, the floorboards groaned under heavy steps. Darryl's tread, deliberate and slow, moved toward the hallway. The doorknob rattled, twisting with the weight of a man who no longer bothered with pretenses. The lies were no longer just on paper. They had taken flesh, and they were standing right outside the door. Darryl gathered Marla and Clara in the living room like a self-appointed judge calling court to order. He stood tall in the center, his voice coated in a false calm, telling them all that I was nothing but a disruptive old man. He painted me as confused, unstable, and bent on dividing the family. My hands tightened on the armrest of the chair as I watched him twist reality with the ease of a seasoned liar. Marla sat stiff on the couch, her hands knotted in her lap. She didn't speak, but her eyes spoke volumes. They pleaded with me, with themselves, with the air in the room. Clara leaned into her mother, wide-eyed, too young to understand but old enough to feel the fear hanging between us. The sight cut through me like a knife. Darryl's voice dripped with mock reason as he said, "Dad's just trying to stir trouble. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's letting his age cloud his judgment." His words were carefully aimed, each syllable another attempt to erase my worth in the eyes of the people I loved most. Rage welled in my chest, but I held it back, knowing his mask would eventually crack. Then came the knock at the door. When I opened it, Lydia Brackett stood there, holding an envelope. She looked uncertain but determined. "Elmer, this ended up in my mailbox. I thought you should see it." I tore it open under Darryl's watchful glare. Inside were documents, vague but telling, bank transfers linked to Darryl's name. Numbers didn't lie, even if he did. Marla's breath caught when she saw them, and even Clara, though too young to grasp the details, sensed the tension breaking. Darryl tried to wave it away. "This is nonsense. A mistake, Lydia. You shouldn't meddle in private family matters." His tone carried that dangerous edge, but the room had shifted. The perfect control he clung to was slipping like sand through his fingers. I seized the moment. "No more lies," I said, standing firm. "I want the truth. What have you done to my daughter? What have you taken from her?" My voice rose, steady and loud enough to fill the room. Daryl snapped. His words poured out like venom, insults and accusations aimed at me, at Marla, even at Clara for crying too much. In his rage, he let slip what he had tried so hard to hide. "She wouldn't have bruises if she just listened." The words hung heavy, choking the air. Clara burst into sobs, the sound piercing the room. Undeniable, pure truth from a child's heart. Marla trembled, silent but no longer able to pretend. Daryl's mask had shattered, and then, as if summoned by fate, Jonas Kemple stepped through the doorway, papers in his hand, his presence calm but commanding. "That's enough," he said firmly. "I have what I need. This ends tonight." Daryl turned, his face red, veins bulging. With a roar, he lunged at Jonah, every ounce of fury unleashed. Daryl's face twisted with fury as he lunged forward. And in that moment, I knew the storm we'd all feared was finally here. The house was unnervingly quiet after the storm of last night. Broken fragments of words and arguments still seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the overturned chair and the wineglass shattered on the floor. Marla sat rigid on the couch, her eyes hollow. Clara curled into her side like a frightened kitten. Jonas stood near the doorway, his papers tucked under his arm, his jaw clenched. And Daryl, he had stormed outside, slamming the door so hard that the frames rattled on the walls. Silence is sometimes louder than shouting. That silence cut deep. The home, once a place of laughter, now felt like a stage where lies and pain had finally ripped the curtains away. Clara's small hand trembled as it gripped her mother's sleeve. Marla rocked gently, murmuring words I couldn't catch, as though trying to reassure both her daughter and herself. The sight hollowed me out. Whatever illusions of normal family life had existed were now in ruins. We all knew it, though no one dared say it aloud. I lowered myself into the armchair opposite them, the springs creaking under my weight. My bones ached, but it wasn't age alone. It was the weight of helplessness pressing down. The ordinary world outside, with neighbors, watering lawns, and cars humming by, felt galaxies away. The truth had seeped into these walls, and there was no going back. Later, as the hours crawled on, Marla's breathing steadied. She glanced at me, her lips trembling. Her voice came barely above a whisper. "Dad, I tried to leave once." The words hung in the air, fragile yet explosive. My heart clenched. She pulled back her sleeve, revealing bruises, dark, ugly reminders that no makeup or scarf could hide forever. My breath caught as shame washed over me. How could I have missed this? How had I convinced myself her silence meant safety? Her confession came haltingly, each word a wound. I told him I was leaving, taking Clara. He laughed, said if I tried, he'd make sure I never saw her again, that he'd tell the courts I was unstable, unfit. He knew exactly how to trap me. The guilt burned hot. I had thought my presence in her life, my occasional visits, were enough. I had told myself she was an adult, making her own choices, but choices under fear aren't choices at all. Tears blurred my sight, but underneath them rose a steady flame. Rage, not the reckless kind, but the kind that steals a man's back when his family is under threat. The sound of the front door opening snapped me back. Daryl entered with a false calm, his expression polished, almost smug. "Well, isn't this cozy?" he said, voice dripping with disdain. The old man whispering poison into my wife's ear again. Marla flinched. Clara pressed closer. I rose slowly, squaring my shoulders, but before I could speak, Daryl tossed a folder onto the table. Papers spilled out, sliding across the wood. "Here," he sneered. "Proof, bank statements, reports. Shows exactly how unstable your father is, how he's been dipping into accounts he doesn't own, trying to cover his mess." I picked up one page, my name, my signature, but not mine. The numbers, the claims, fiction crafted to discredit me. Anger surged, not for myself, but for the cruel precision of it. He wasn't just trying to break me. He was building a case to bury me in doubt before anyone else could hear the truth. He leaned closer, his smile sharp. If anyone looks into this, who do you think they'll believe? A senile old man? Or me? The provider? The husband? My fist tightened around the page until it crumpled. The urge to shout nearly boiled over, but I forced myself still. Losing control would only feed his lies. Yet inside, my heart hammered with fear. If his poison spread far enough, he could make me vanish in the eyes of others, just as he had made Marla's pain invisible. Jonas cleared his throat. His timing was deliberate, his voice cutting through Daryl's charade. "That's an interesting claim," he said, pulling out a separate set of papers from his briefcase. "Because I have bank records that don't match what you've shown. In fact, they suggest money has been leaving Marla's account into places you control." Daryl. The room froze. Marla's eyes widened. Clara whimpered softly. Lydia's words from days ago echoed in my ears, and Daryl's mask cracked, just for a second. His jaw tightened. His hands twitched. Jonas laid the papers on the table. "This is only the beginning. The trail is sloppy, but clear enough to raise questions. And questions are often the start of the end." I looked at Daryl then. His fury simmered beneath the surface, eyes burning with a promise of vengeance. He wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but the illusion he had built, the one that kept us all chained in silence, had finally fractured. The fight ahead would be brutal, but for the first time, hope flickered through the fear. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where truth was supposed to be weighed and measured. Jonas walked beside me, his briefcase steady in his grip, while the papers proving irregular transfers sat folded tightly in my jacket pocket. My fingers brushed them again and again, as if they might dissolve if I let go. Marla lagged a few steps behind, her shoulders drawn tight, fear carved into every line of her face. Clara stayed with Lydia in the hallway, her small hand waving before she disappeared into a waiting room. For a moment, I wondered if she would even remember this day, or if it would blur into the shadows of her childhood. We stepped into the courtroom. The light overhead felt too sharp, the benches too empty. Marla sat stiffly next to me, avoiding my eyes. I wanted to tell her it would be all right, but even I wasn't sure. My heart hammered with the weight of decades of silence, of fatherly duties I thought I had fulfilled, now stacked against me in this cold chamber. Daryl arrived with a smirk that belonged more to a stage actor than a husband facing accusations. His suit was pressed, his hair perfect, as if appearances alone could erase truth. When he stood to speak, his voice carried the kind of practiced calm that dripped with poison. "Your Honor," he began, "this isn't about my wife or me. This is about an old man who cannot let go of control. He's meddled in our marriage, manipulated our finances, and now he's trying to turn my daughter against me." The words hit harder than I expected. It wasn't just a lie. It was a performance meant to make me small, to erase me in front of the very people I was trying to protect. My jaw tightened, but Jonas placed a hand on my arm, signaling patience. Then came the twist. Daryl produced a witness, a coworker I didn't know, who claimed I had bragged about trying to ruin my son-in-law's marriage. The testimony dripped with rehearsed certainty. I wanted to shout, to tear apart every false word, but I forced myself still. The judge leaned back, skeptical but silent, allowing the statement to hang in the air like a bad smell. Humiliation burned my chest. To the court, I was no longer just a father. I was a caricature, a bitter, meddling old man. Jonas rose calmly, the very picture of control. He approached the witness with a steady voice. "Sir," Jonas asked, "what department do you work in?" The man hesitated, stumbled. Jonas pressed again, questions sharp and precise, each one peeling away at the flimsy story. Soon, the co-worker's answers began to collapse on themselves. He contradicted his own timeline, claimed meetings that never happened. The judge's eyebrows lifted, the air shifting. I sat back, exhaling slowly, My prayers turned into something closer to resolve. Jonas was dismantling the lies one by one, and yet the battle wasn't his alone. Beside me, Marla leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "I should speak," she whispered. Her hands trembled, her lips pale. "But if I do..." Her sentence trailed off, swallowed by fear. I pressed her hand gently, letting her know she wasn't alone. Jonas was steady, but it would take her courage to cut through Daryl's web. Jonas straightened and announced he had new evidence. He pulled from his briefcase a document I hadn't seen before, and when he spoke, the room shifted on its axis. "This," he said, holding it up, "is a property transfer form, signed and processed under Mr. Voss's direction. The property belonged jointly to Marla Voss. She never consented." The words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Daryl shifted in his seat, his perfect composure cracking. Marla's breath hitched. For the first time, she stood. Her voice shook, but it carried. "I never signed those papers," she said, eyes fixed on the judge. "He told me I didn't need to worry about it. He lied." Her words, trembling but resolute, did more damage than any document could. Daryl's face twisted, rage flashing before he forced it back into a mask of calm. The gavel struck. The judge announced the matter would be examined further, his tone grave, as if he too sensed the rot beneath the surface. As I sat there, watching my daughter's fragile strength rise against the weight of fear, I realized the courtroom wasn't just benches and rules, it was a battlefield, and Daryl had just lost his first weapon. The table at Lydia's house carried the weight of a fragile piece. Marla sat across from me, her fork tracing slow circles on her plate, while Clara finally broke into a laugh at something small Lydia said. That laugh was soft, uncertain, but real. The first I'd heard from her in weeks. For a moment, it almost felt as though the darkness that had gripped us could be shaken off. I chewed slowly, tasting little, clinging to the thought that maybe, just maybe, the courthouse hearing had shifted the tide. Still, beneath that glimmer of relief, the air carried a quiet heaviness. Marla's eyes darted to the window now and then, like someone expecting a shadow to appear. Lydia tried to fill the silence with talk about her garden, the tomatoes ripening early, but even she kept glancing at the clock. The world outside was too quiet, and that silence pressed against the walls like an unwelcome guest. After dinner, as Clara played with one of Lydia's old dolls on the rug, I felt something in my chest settle. Justice seemed possible, but I'd lived long enough to know peace that comes too easily doesn't last. It was Lydia who noticed it first. She moved to draw the curtains in the front room and paused, her hand freezing in midair. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "There's a car out there. Been parked a long while." I joined her, peeking past the curtain. A dark sedan sat idle by the curb, its headlights off, the shape of a man visible only as a still shadow behind the wheel. My stomach tightened. There was no doubt in my mind who had sent him, or worse, who was sitting there himself. The phone rang, startling us all. Jonas's voice came sharp on the other end. "Elmer, listen carefully. Daryl's already moving. He's got someone inside the courthouse feeding him updates." That's how he knew what Jonas presented today. He'll try to use every trick to discredit you before the case builds further. The idea of betrayal inside the very system meant to protect us sank like lead in my gut. Someone was helping Daryl, and that meant no place was safe, not even the halls of justice. I hung up, forcing calm into my voice for Marla's sake. We stay inside, doors locked. But inside, the unease was a slow, steady fire. Later that night, Marla sat across from me at Lydia's kitchen table. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around a cup of tea. "Dad," she whispered, eyes wet. "I don't think I'm strong enough. Every time I try to protect Clara, I freeze." "And he knows how to silence me." I reached across, covering her hand with mine. The skin beneath was thin, bruised, marked by years of silent suffering. "You've already endured more than most could," I said softly. "Strength isn't never falling. It's standing up again when the ground keeps shifting beneath you." But even as I spoke, my own guilt pressed hard. Memories came rushing. Times when I should have pushed harder, seen sooner, refused to let her slip away into this marriage. Failures as a father lingered like ghosts at the table. Age had made me slower, my hands less steady, and yet, watching my daughter, I knew surrender was the only true weakness left. She leaned her head into her hands. If he takes Clara. Her words broke off, unfinished. The thought alone hung heavy enough. I wanted to promise safety, but promises are fragile things when shadows circle the house. The knock came near midnight, sharp, deliberate. Lydia moved toward the door, but I stopped her. Something in the pit of my stomach already knew. An envelope lay on the porch. No sender's mark, just my name scrawled across the front. I opened it with a hand that trembled more than I wanted anyone to see. Inside was a single photograph, Clara in Lydia's yard, taken earlier that very day, her small figure frozen in play, unaware that someone had been close enough, watching, framing her through a lens. Marla gasped when she saw it. Lydia muttered something under her breath, crossing herself. I stood there, the photo shaking in my hand, my heart hammering harder than it had in years. It wasn't a warning, it was a declaration. He was closer than we ever imagined. I moved to the window, lights dimmed, and planted myself in the old chair with a clear view of the street. My revolver, untouched for decades, sat heavy in my other hand. That night, sleep was a stranger. Every creak of the house, every flicker of headlights down the street pulled my finger closer to the trigger. I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a sentry, guarding what little remained of my family. And as the hours dragged into the early dawn, one thought refused to leave me. The storm had found our doorstep. The morning broke with a gray light that pressed against the curtains of Lydia's living room. I sat at her kitchen table, Jonas across from me. Papers spread out between us like the remnants of a long and ugly war. He leaned in, his voice low but firm, telling me what I had feared all along. Daryl wasn't finished. He had filed an emergency motion to take Clara back, twisting every shred of falsehood into a last desperate grab. Marla's hands trembled as she clutched her coffee cup, eyes wide with panic. Clara was still asleep upstairs, her little chest rising in peaceful ignorance. For a moment, fear clawed at me. The thought of that man dragging my granddaughter back into his control made my breath tighten. But then I looked at Marla, fragile yet fighting to stand, and I knew I couldn't let the fear take me. "This ends today," I said, voice steady. My years were heavy on my shoulders, but age wasn't weakness. It was steel tempered by loss and sacrifice. By mid-morning, we stood once again inside the courthouse, the walls echoing with murmurs. Daryl strode in like a man on borrowed time, carrying folders stuffed with lies. He introduced new witnesses, faces eager to parrot rehearsed lines. One claimed I was unstable. Another swore Marla was the one neglecting Clara. The bile rose in my throat as the judge listened, expression unreadable. Then Jonas stood, calm, measured. He began tearing through the false testimonies. One by one, he presented photographs Lydia had quietly taken, bruises, dates, timestamps. He laid out medical records that contradicted Daryl's polished narrative, and then, the crack we hadn't expected, a clerk from the courthouse itself stepped forward, pale and shaking. She admitted she had passed documents to Daryl, pressured by his promises and threats. But now, she exposed every manipulation he'd spun. It was like watching the strings of a puppet snap, one by one. Rage boiled in me, but alongside it, a flicker of hope, fragile but real. The tension peaked as the judge leaned forward, eyes fixed on Daryl. His ruling came swift, words sharp as the crack of a whip, full custody to Marla, immediate protection for Clara, and Daryl stripped of any legal rights. Relief rushed through me, but it lasted only a heartbeat. Daryl's mask collapsed, his face twisted, spittle flying as he shouted at the bench, lunging forward like a cornered animal. Marla flinched. Clara whimpered in Lydia's arms, and instinct took hold. I stepped in front of them, spine straight despite the ache of 70 years, raising an arm like a shield. For one terrifying second, I thought he might reach us. But the gavel thundered, and officers closed in. Hands pinned him down as he thrashed. Then came the final blow. Jonas revealed sealed files tying Daryl not only to abuse, but to business fraud and conspiracy. His greed had built the noose that now closed around him. As they dragged him out, eyes blazing with a fury that had lost all power, I felt the weight lift. Justice, long denied, had finally spoken. That night, the house was quiet. Clara slept soundly upstairs at Lydia's, her small breaths steady as a lullaby. Marla sat beside me at the kitchen table, eyes red but clearer than they had been in years. She whispered, "I don't know if I can ever thank you." I reached across, placing my weathered hand over hers. "We don't choose the family we're born into," I said, voice thick with all the years behind me, "but we choose the family we protect. And that choice matters more than anything." Outside, the night hummed with crickets, ordinary and calm, for the first time in what felt like forever. The air didn't carry the weight of dread. Daryl's shadow may have lingered in memory, but it was powerless now. What remained was scarred, yes, but unbroken. A family rebuilt, not through perfection, but through the fight to stand for one another. As the clock ticked past midnight, I leaned back, eyes closing. A prayer of gratitude whispered in silence. Tomorrow, I believed, might finally hold peace